Member for Adelaide.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Unfortunately, I am appalled, genuinely appalled, by the measures which are contained within this government's budget and which we now see before this parliament for debate. It is, of course, not unusual for people on other sides of the chamber to have slightly different priorities, to have some different ideas about where we should be placing emphasis and funding. But it is unusual for us to see a budget of the level of cruelty which we see in this budget, a budget that has so many proposals outlining just how out of touch this government is, a budget that is so full of wrong priorities, of inconsistencies and of short-sighted, vicious measures which will affect those who are most vulnerable in our community. Now, there are many measures in this budget which will have a devastating impact on the area that I am lucky enough to represent in this parliament, being the great seat of Adelaide, and I will be taking other opportunities to outline specifically some of those measures that will affect our community, that will affect our local pensioners, that will affect our local families, and will affect all of those who are sick and in need of our fantastic universal healthcare system. But during this particular contribution, I want to focus on one area of this budget where I think it outlines, as much as any other, just how short-sighted this government are and just how deceitful this government were in the lead-up to the election, saying one thing and now doing the complete opposite. And that is in the area of education, because education gets absolutely smashed in this budget, from early childhood education, where those opposite now are refusing to commit to ongoing federal funding for our preschool system, despite all of the research and all of the evidence that shows that this is the most effective way to make a positive impact on the life of that individual. To our school system, which I'm going to be addressing in some detail in a moment, and right through to the higher education system, where what this government proposes is lock out those from low and middle income families. Let's shut the doors to our universities by pushing fees skyrocketing up, by ensuring that debts increase faster than they previously would have on these now massively increased fees, and to top it all off, to make sure that those massively increased fees that are increasing even quicker due to their indexation changes need to be paid back quicker. That is the proposal that we have from those opposite to try and make this nation the smart country that we can be. Now, when it comes to early childhood education, when it comes to schools, when it comes to higher education, I'll tell you very clearly what our side of the parliament believes. We absolutely believe that investing in education and having a quality education system is the #1 most effective way that you can make sure that children have greater opportunities than their parents had and that their grandparents had before them. This is the way that we transform our nation. This is the way that we make sure that we are a smarter, more productive and prosperous nation into the future. But those opposite clearly take a different view, because when it comes to education, this is a budget that very, very clearly fits the Abbott template. That template that is step #1, say whatever it takes to the Australian population before the election. Step #2, break each and every one of those commitments after the election. And step #3, unfairly punish the people that can least afford it. That is what we've seen all throughout this budget when it comes to education. Now, just to refresh, before the election, we heard some very different messages from this government when it came to education. We saw the Prime Minister, the now Prime Minister Tony Abbott, publicly claiming to be on a, quote, absolute unity ticket with Labor on school funding. We heard the now Education Minister saying to the Australian public, you can vote Liberal or Labor and you'll get exactly the same funding for your school. And we saw on polling day at the election booths around this nation, we saw huge oversized posters making sure that the last thing that voters learned before they went into that polling booth was from these posters which said, Liberals will match Labor's school funding dollar for dollar. Well, what a disgrace. What a disgrace for you to deceive the Australian public to that extent. Try and convince everyone of a unity ticket. Try and convince everyone that there wouldn't be major changes and cuts to our schools, to our early childhood services, to our universities, because we were all on the one ticket of believing that we needed to improve our education system. And instead, what do we see just months later in the very first budget from this very same government and these very same individuals who were out there making these? What do we see in the first budget? We see the biggest cut to schools in this nation's history. We see there $30 billion to be ripped out of Australian schools, making sure that in fact every school and every student will be worse off as a result of the fact that they trusted this government to stay to their word and to improve our schools. Now, what we've seen is that years 5 and 6 of the Gonski funding have been dumped, leaving schools $6.5 billion worse off in federal funding alone. This comes on top of this government's earlier measure to rip $1 billion out of the trades training centre programs, building trades training centres in our schools so that we could make sure that this nation was equipped with the skills that we need for our future workforce. $1 billion already gone, the program scrapped entirely. But now what we see in this budget is very clearly why, when this government has been asked to repeat the guarantees that they were happy to make before the election, when they've been asked in this parliament will they repeat the guarantee that no school will be worse off, they have absolutely refused to do so. And in this budget we see the reason why they had no choice but to walk away from that guarantee. Because in this budget we learn that not only have they thrown aside the Gonski reforms, the biggest review into Australia's school system in over 40 years, they've just tossed aside because apparently Education Minister Pyne knows better than all of the experts, knows better than all of the academics, knows better than all of the principals, all of the teachers, all of the students, all of the parents who took part in the biggest review we've got to find the solutions for our education system. They've thrown that aside. But they haven't just thrown aside the Commonwealth commitment. What they've also done is, whilst they promised that they would honour the agreements that were made before the election, now they've come out and said, well, actually, we're throwing away those conditions that said that in order for the states to receive federal funding, they had to guarantee that they too would boost their funding to their education systems. In fact, under those agreements, the states had to put in an extra $1 for every extra $2 of federal funding they received. No more, meaning every school is worse off. But they also have let the states off the hook when it comes to guaranteeing indexation rates. And so what we see right now is that right across Australia, this government, this Prime Minister, has given every state and territory government a green light to start cutting school funding. When we were meant to be in a situation where principals were looking at how they were going to use additional resources to improve their schools, we now have them sitting around scratching their heads and trying to work out what they're going to cut as a result of this government's ridiculously short-sighted measures. Now, not content with that, they also want to give a bit of a provocation to make sure that those cuts start soon and that they start hard, so that they have announced that whereas just over 12 months ago the now Education Minister was out there saying that indexation of schools at 3% was a frightening prospect. He was saying that that could not possibly assist our Australian education sector to be of the quality that it deserves to be. But what has this budget done? This budget has now set in stone an indexation rate at just CPI, which is currently just at 2.5%. The Education Minister, who said it was frightening the prospect of 3% indexation, has now outlined just 2.5% indexation for our schools. What that means in real terms is a very real cut, because we know that the cost of delivering education is running at over 5%. So what the Education Minister described as frightening, he's outdone by something that is truly terrifying. But in particular, I want to outline one of the measures which I think is the most appalling that this government have gone and betrayed some of the most vulnerable Australians with, and that is children with a disability. Now, I know that in my discussions with principals right around Australia, one of the most immediate challenges that they face, the most common funding concern raised for me, is support for children with disability. We know that more and more students with disability are moving into our schools right across the community. This is a wonderful change and one which I hope will continue to accelerate in coming years. But to date, Our school systems have largely failed to properly and consistently identify students with disability, let alone provide them with the equal education opportunities that they absolutely deserve. Now, when Labor set out to define the needs-based funding loading for these students, adequate information was simply not available, and we were upfront with the community about that. How many children need additional support? At what level of support do they need? How many teachers are appropriately qualified to deliver this support? What training's needed to get them there? And exactly what resourcing is required to ensure that every student gets the support that they need in every school in Australia? These questions could not, and sadly still cannot, be accurately answered. But in government, we set out to actually come up with a solution to this problem, working with school systems to fix it. We set out to collect the data, to standardise the definitions and implement a properly formed loading to support students with disability from 2015. And in the meantime, interim funding was put in place. Now, those opposite have said that they support this. They've said that it was a bipartisan commitment to the 2015 timeline and to delivering the necessary resources once that need had been properly defined. So, a new loading, supposedly to be rolled out from the beginning of the school year in 2015, with additional resources. It's interesting, what additional funding did this government then put in this budget to support this? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. In fact, what they did was they cut the more support for students with disability funding that was in the budget, and now they have delayed those crucial timeframes, meaning that many of the students out there who most need this parliament to be standing up and fighting for their access to quality educational support have been cruelly, cruelly left behind by this government that's just placed it in the too hard basket. Those opposite apparently don't want to talk about schools, are asking me to go on to higher education. Well, I'm not surprised that you don't want to talk about schools, because you know that schools are angry. You know that parents are angry. You know that teachers are angry. And it's not just because of the Prime Minister's duplicity and deliberate deception, although of course those are reasons enough for a great deal of anger, but it is because of the very real impacts that this government's budget will have in classrooms right across Australia. Cuts to extension programs, cuts to literacy and numeracy programs, subject choices gone, sport and music options gone, remedial support gone, support for students with a disability just not there. Now, not in 4 years' time, as some on the government backbench seem to be reassuring themselves that none of this is real yet. It's just something we're saying we'll do later. The Prime Minister is now goading state premiers into making cuts to our schools right now. And those opposite don't have to believe Labor spokespeople on that. You can listen to your own Liberal counterparts. We see in New South Wales, Mike Baird described the budget as, I quote, a kick in the guts. Campbell Newman, not somebody that I would regularly quote as agreeing with much that he has to say, but he has come out publicly warning that ratings agencies are on the phone looking at state budgets now, and they need to look at the savings that they will make. States are being pressured to cut early and to cut hard by this Prime Minister and by all of those that sit opposite defending this disgusting budget. Now, the Prime Minister has helped the states and territories put aside their differences and band together because they have a common enemy, and that is this government who is walking away from school funding reform, who is walking away from the opportunity for us to implement the solutions that we know that our school system needs. This is a cowardly, low-rent, hard-cutting and unfair budget, and on this side of the House we will not stand for it. We believe that circumstances of birth should not determine destiny. We believe that it's the size of a person's brain, not the weight of their wallet, that matters. We believe that country kids should not be allowed to continue to fall behind city kids when it comes to the schools and their educational attainment. We believe that the 2.5-year gap between the least well-off and the most well-off students is a blight on our country and a threat to our future. And we absolutely believe in needs-based funding, that no matter what school, no matter what schooling sector, no matter what state or territory, every child in this nation should be able to rely upon this parliament to make sure that their school is a great school. This would not be so appalling if it wasn't for the fact that We didn't have the solutions. We do. We've just gone through that process, and this government can offer no excuse for throwing away the educational opportunities of young Australians, and doing so while still putting aside over $20 billion to give to millionaires to have a baby. Order. This is wrong priorities, and we oppose it every step of the way.